Be a retrospective of Ian Churchill. It's a pretty imaginative title for the discussion, but we came up with a better one.
We did?
Yeah.
Go on then.
Yeah, it's From Ocean Point to the X-Mansion and Back Again. And if it doesn't make sense now, it will.
Yep. It's got style and grace. I like that, Chris. That was great.
It's got a little bit of flair.
It has got flair.
So, talking about flair, we're going to discuss how you actually got yours and the early days of it. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about what kind of comics you grew up with, the stuff you read as a kid, and where you were drawing inspiration from early on.
Right. Comics-wise, well, yeah. I got into comics when I was very young, I suppose. It was the John Romita Sr. Run on Captain America that really spoke to me, I guess. And I think that was the first time I realised that people actually drew Comics. Before then, I'd have been about 6, I would have thought, 6 or 7. Before that, I just, I knew they were there, I just didn't realise people drew them. It's a weird thing in my head, I don't know. I remember I had my first comic bought for me by my gran when I was about 5, I would imagine. And I think it was Mighty World of Marvel, it was one of the British reprints. I know it had the Hulk on the front cover, that much I know I can remember.
Was it one of the annuals?
No, it wasn't an annual.
Okay.
I think it might have been number 1 actually. I wouldn't put money on it, but it might have been. Because it wasn't just the Hulk on the front, there were some other characters as well, and I seem to remember that being the same sort of setup as number 1. And then my gran bought me a Marvel Man annual when I was about 6 or 7, I think. And I liked all the bright colours on that, and that's kind of what got me into comics. It was superheroes. I mean, a lot of people poo-poo superheroes these days, but I love superheroes. I always have done, and it's what drew me into comics. I was thinking the other day actually, if I'd grown up in this day and age, it would probably been movies. Superheroes would have got me into movies and things like that. I don't know. It's because you could only get superheroes through comics back then that I gravitated towards comics. I don't know which path I'd have gone down if I'd have grown up in this sort of day and age. It's a weird one.
Do you think you might have wanted to be a filmmaker then, instead of drawing?
Yeah, possibly. I like storytelling. I like sequential stuff. I think, as far as my career goes, I'm not the best artist in the world by a long stretch, but I do have a certain knack for storytelling. And I think that's why I've always had consistent work over the years. Because it's not easy telling a story and picking the right angles to make it flow coherently so that everyone can follow it easily. And I do have a certain knack for that. So, maybe I would have gone into movies. It would have been a nice avenue to explore. Yeah.
Talking about the film and television, there was also some of that inspired you growing up, wasn't there?
Are you referring to?
I don't know. What would you like me to be referring to?
I don't know what you're referring to.
There is, of course, The Man from Atlantis.
The Man from Atlantis. I used to love that, yeah.
Has anyone seen The Man from Atlantis? There's a few people.
Yeah. It's an old TV show starring Patrick Duffy. And it did have a big impact on me when I was a kid. I think I must have been about 8 when that came out, 7 or 8, something like that. And I remember everybody trying to swim like him, because he had his hands at his sides and sort of like bobbing up and down like a dolphin. I remember my dad tried it and hit his head on the bottom of the swimming pool, which was quite funny. But my brother and I used to love it. And it probably was one of the reasons why I gave Marine Man webbed hands, I think, just remembering back to that. I bought some episodes recently and rewatched them, and they're not as good as you remember them. None of these things are from your childhood, are they? It's still good, and that the first pilot movie was actually quite good even by today's standards, but the ones that followed it in the TV series were dreadful.
It's actually a whole different kind of storytelling, the older stuff as well. Like, you couldn't do that today because our tastes as an audience and attention span is different.
Absolutely. I think that's why they needed the new Man of Steel movie. Superman needed rebooting for the movie audience. I'm a very big fan of the first Superman movie, but I watched it recently and it is starting to look a bit dated now. There's a lot that could be trimmed and make it a much leaner movie.
Yeah.
I think it still speaks to me, and I still watch it quite regularly because I love the first appearance of Superman in Metropolis when he goes up and saves Lois on the top of the building with the helicopter. I watch that over and over and over again. Yeah.
See, Ian's a romantic. That's what you've already found out.
Yeah, I guess I am a bit.
So you mentioned there the creation of Marine Man, and we're going to actually come back to that. That's the Ocean Point part. So if you're paying attention. So what I wanted to talk about was how did you actually first break into comics? So at what point did it look to become a career?
Yeah, I always liked comics and I always drew them. And I created Marine Man when I was 8. I created the Coven when I was 17. And I didn't go to college. I left school and I went on. Back in the old days, there was something called a YTS scheme, which it was a youth training scheme. And I had a position at a graphic design studio, and I would do that most days of the week. And then one day I'd get a day released to college, and they wouldn't teach the stuff that I wanted to learn at college, so I was a bit bored, and that's when I created the Coven in my boredom hours. And then I kind of had pressure from my parents and everything else to get a proper job, so I went down the graphic design route, and I did genuinely enjoy graphic design. I still do now. I did it for 7 years or so, and then there was a big recession. Much like the one we've experienced recently. And I had to reevaluate where I was going and what I was doing. It was actually an episode of Star Trek that changed my life. It was the one with Captain Picard when a Nausicaan stabs him in the heart, and they do like this alternate reality of what would happen if he hadn't had the balls to get up and do something and take control of a situation. And it was all about you've got to make a definite decision and follow it and take a chance and to get anywhere in life. And I had the offer of a job at a graphic design studio dangling and waiting for me, or I could go to London to UCAC and take some comic book samples along and see if anything happened. And I chose to do the second one.
Wow.
I hadn't drawn comics in ages because I'd kind of, sometimes you read comics and then you get out of it and you find your way back to them. You do in your teenage years at least and stuff. And I'd gotten out of comics a bit, and it was Todd McFarlane's run on Spider-Man actually that tempted me back in, because I drew in a very cartoony style and he was drawing Spider-Man in a very cartoony style. And that kind of made me think, well, maybe there's an avenue for me to explore in comics, and I might be able to get some work. So I, just off the top of my head, drew some Captain America pages, probably inspired by the fact that I loved Romita's run so much back in the old days, and took it up to London, to UCAC, and got in line. And I was chatting to the guy. I got into the line that made the most sense to me. There were lots of people reviewing artwork, and I was just sort of watching different people in the queues and figuring out which guy seemed to make a lot of sense. And I didn't know who he was, but I got into his line, and he was reviewing all these people. And I was chatting to the guy in front of me, and he was saying, yeah, but nobody ever gets spotted at conventions anymore or anything like that. And I said, I think Jim Lee did, didn't he, or something? And he said, yeah, massive conversation about that. Anyway, cut long story short, got up, guy looked at my stuff and went a little bit quiet and looked up at me and said, are you getting any work? And I said, no. And he said, I think I might give you some work. Have you got any copies? I said, no, because I didn't know the protocol. I didn't know you had to take copies along to conventions or anything. You didn't have the internet back then to swat up on all this stuff. So I had to barrel across the road to the student union and make all these photocopies and bring them back over to him. And he said he'd take them back to New York. And I left him with it. Didn't even ask who he was or anything. I just took it for granted that, hey, I've made an impact. So I went and had a beer, and I was sitting on the wall outside. And as he came out, I just tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, who are you, by the way?" And he turned around and said, "I'm Bob Harris. I'm the editor of the X-Men." And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's nice to know." So he took my stuff back to New York with him and gave me a fake assignment to see if I could to make the deadline. And I made the deadline pretty okay, I think, and I've pretty much had constant work since. My first ever professional gig was a backup strip in an X-Men annual with Scott Lobdell.
Right.
You know, so I mean, I was really in at the deep end, and I didn't go the normal route. Most people from the UK used to go through 2000 AD or what have you, different ways to superheroes, I guess. And I'd always been into American comics, specifically, bless you, specifically Marvel. I grew to appreciate DC a little bit later in life, but when I was a kid, I always gravitated towards the Marvel stuff. And I've completely gone off track because you sneezed. Can you remind me where I was?
You were explaining about you getting your first work, so you had the X-Men annual backup, and you had gone straight to American comics.
I was just very lucky. And I didn't even go the Marvel UK route. I think Brian Hitch started at Marvel UK and worked his way through that way and stuff. I was just very lucky, right place, right time, but I had to put myself in the right place at the right time, and it was that episode of Star Trek which inspired me to do it. I know it sounds corny, but it is true. And then after that initial assignment, it did dry up slightly, and I took another chance and went to New York. I'd done some more samples. And I didn't book ahead or anything. I just showed up, and I was going to go to Marvel and try and get some more work because they'd hired me initially. And if that didn't pan out, I was going to go across the street and show some samples to DC and see if they'd take me in. But Bob was there, and I went up and had a chat with him, and I think Suzanne Gaffney at the time, which is when Carlos was supposed to be here today. Carlos and I both broke in at the same time, and we both had the same editor, and Suzanne Gaffney was one of those editors.
Right.
And she gave me some work, and Lisa Patrick as well when I was working on Cable. She was my first proper editor. And from then on, after that trip, I had consistent work. And one of the best compliments at the time for me was Bob Harris seemed to think I had some of the flair of Arthur Adams, and I was like walking around on a cloud after he said that, because Arthur Adams was one of my big heroes at the time. In fact, I made a complete idiot of myself first time I met him in San Diego. I was very, very drunk, and I was with my editor, Eddie Berganza, and we were walking around San Diego, and he pointed him out and said, "That's Art Adams over there." And I said, "No way." And it was around the time of Wayne's World. I don't know if you remember that. And it was like, "Oh, what, cool, Wayne," and that sort of stuff. And I went up to this poor guy, and I went down on one knee, and I said, "I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy." And he didn't know where to look. He was looking around and he go, "Get up, kid." And he was very gracious about it all, but Eddie never lets me forget it. Very embarrassing. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, we had an exhibition of Ian's stuff at Orbital Comics in the gallery there a few months ago, and someone was looking at the pencils. It was actually the Ravager's pencils.
Okay.
And he ended up picking up some pages of that, but he was saying the pencils were so tight, it was like Arthur Adams.
Oh,
he actually didn't know the difference.
Oh, that's very nice to know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I draw like Arthur Adams, but I think I share some aspects of my artwork with him. I think I think I've got a dynamic flair to some of my stuff.
That's the word of the panel, flair.
Is it?
Yeah, we started with flair and we're back to...
Flair. I was watching a movie the other night that had flair in. Have you ever seen Office Space? Mike Judge movie. Very good if you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Very, very funny. Even now, I mean, it's very 90s, but it's very good. And they were talking about flair, which is like little badges that they have on their braces at the restaurant. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. I go off topic a lot, so if I do, Chris will bring me back.
I will try. I was curious about what made you adopt the style that you're pretty much, I would say, most known for. Because your natural style, you say, is a little bit more cartoony.
It is,
But there's a kind of I guess it was the style that was going around in the 90s at the time, a bit quite image-esque.
Yeah, it was very
so
prevalent.
How did that come about?
Well, Jim was very popular. Jim still is very popular, and quite rightly so. And when I was breaking in, like I said, I was more cartoony. Everything was very well-rounded, and it was just... I always gravitated towards Disney for some reason. I like that sort of like flowing style. And Bob suggested that I may get more work if I could harden everything up and draw a bit more like Jim Lee. And apparently that was the thing that most artists were being told at the time when they broke in. I've learned in retrospect. And so I did try, and he was right. I got more work. It became popular. I got the Deadpool miniseries. And you kind of build a rod for your own back. That's how people expect me to draw now, or did for a long time. And that's what the editors wanted. So to get work, you have to draw in a certain way that gets you work. And that's pretty much how I started. I kind of learnt on the job. I learnt as I went along. And if you look at some of my old stuff, you can see the progression.
Yeah.
And as certain artists became more popular, I think I reflected that in my style as well, because I knew I'd get more work if I emulated the current trend.
Yep.
So if you look at the beginning of my run on cable, it's far more Jim Lee-esque, and that's the stuff that Jeff liked, Jeff Loeb. We'll probably talk about that in a bit. But you can see the progression, and to the point that when Joe Madureira became quite popular, the later parts of my cable run started to get a bit more cartoony again. And then, when someone else became more popular, I tightened it up and reined it back a bit. It's not something I was conscious of at the time, but when I've looked back at stuff, it's pretty obvious, I think.
Yeah. Well, I guess they were telling everyone to do it back then. I don't know if you've ever seen Fantastic Four. I think it was Unlimited. It was quarterly they did, and you had Herb Trimpe who was actually doing it, and he was emulating Rob Liefeld style.
Yeah.
And actually really well. But he's one of the guys that was from the Silver Age, classic guy, and now emulating Liefeld.
Speaking of Herb Trimpe, that was one of the people that got me into comics as well, because the Captain Britain series that he did, I loved that. I've still got 2 copies of every issue at home in my collection.
You were like a speculator before they existed.
I guess so, yeah. And I've got 2 issues of every Alan Davis Captain Britain as well, pretty much. And some of them signed by him.
Yeah.
He's a god. I mean, he's one of my all-time influences as well.
And so I was able to slip in a mention of Rob Liefeld there, because he was one of those characters that you fell in with.
I did.
So how did you go from Marvel to being with Rob's entourage?
That's jumping forward a bit, but to preface that, I worked with Jeff Loeb on cable, and Jeff went into business with Rob. I think he was writing one of the Heroes Reborn things, Jeff.
Right,
Because he was writing cable with me. Then he went and wrote something with Rob at Heroes Reborn, which was like the new 52 back then, pretty much. And Jeff wanted me to come and do some stuff over with his little crowd on the Heroes Reborn. So I said, okay. I wanted to draw Captain America, and the Avengers were on offer. So I decided to do that. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then after that finished, I think Jeff and Rob set up Awesome Comics along with someone else. I can't remember the other partner's name. I think it was a silent partner.
Yeah.
And they wanted me to come and do some stuff with them. So I said yes. Because I like working with Jeff. It was Jeff that tempted me over there. It wasn't anything to do with Rob.
See, I was going to get to asking you about Jeff, but it's... Yeah, you know the progression better than me.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people say I draw like Rob. I can't see it myself. Maybe the dynamics that we were talking about earlier has something to do with it, but if you put my artwork next to Rob's, it's easy to spot the difference.
There's feet.
Yeah, there's feet. Yeah. Not smoke everywhere, yeah. Or strategically placed rocks. Yeah.
Did he ever teach you his kind of art foo of being able to drive and draw?
I watched him do that. He draws a lot in Starbucks, actually.
Right.
And it seems to work for him. I don't know how he does it. I tried it myself. We both sat in Starbucks one day and had like a drawing board on our laps, and we were sort of like drawing away, and people would bring you coffee and things. And I mean, Rob is a great guy, and he really lived the life back then. He had a house you would not believe. It had a turret. It had a swimming pool. He had 2 jet skis. You know, he lived the life. He had a shooting range in his basement, and a panic room. No, it was real cool pad. It's like one of these ones you see on these rock star things.
That was in case the other image founders came round.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. And I had a lot of fun times there. I used to work in the turret actually. I had this gorgeous view of Orange County, which was fantastic.
Mm.
And I ended up spending a lot of time in Laguna Beach while I was over there as well, and doing some stuff when I was working with him.
Did you actually live over there for a while then?
Briefly, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I had a great time. I wasn't far from the beach either, which I love being near the sea. So fun times, yeah. It's just really great going down memory lane actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't end well. It's fair to say, but at the time it was great. Matt Hawkins, I used to hang out with him all the time. Eric Stevenson, because they're all mainstays of Rob's little enclave. Dan Frager, and everybody's gone on to new and different things.
Yeah, very different.
I think I've pretty much kept in contact with most of them. I still talk to Eric, obviously, because he's the publisher at Image, and Matt Hawkins is the head guy at Top Cow. Dan is now, I think, animation director on the Ricky Gervais thing, isn't he?
That's right.
And I think the only one I don't keep in contact with is Rob, really. But that was just because things ended a bit messy. So I've seen him since, and we've gotten on fine. But it's just not something that we haven't stayed in touch as such.
Oh, before we, I guess, touch on the end, I did want to talk about Coven.
Okay.
Because that was a favourite series of mine. Has anyone seen Coven? No.
No.
Actually missing out. It was really great.
Thanks.
I was actually a super fan of that in the... It was the 90s still, wasn't it?
Was the 90s.
The end of the... End of the 90s?
It was around the same time Michael was doing Witchblade, wasn't it?
Okay, yeah. So
Michael
sort of
Turner, by the
the
way.
mid to late 90s, I think. And it was a point at which I was super fanboyish and I would buy every variant cover. So, you know, we've all been there. And I would order them from the States because I lived in Australia, and I would have to send away, and it would cost a fortune to get all these different, like American Entertainment, Dynamic Forces exclusives, all these different things.
QVC, did you watch QVC?
No.
Nick Barucci used to do QVC over here.
Right.
And he'd sell all the variants on the TV, and I'd go on and do like a little spot on the telly.
Oh, I would have got super excited. I would have been like, I'll order
you would
it all.
have been, because you could phone in and chat and everything like that. And I did one with John Cassaday, actually. So there's both of us on there drawing little pictures while Nick's going crazy trying to sell comics to everybody. It was good fun. I really enjoyed it.
That's great. Is there any footage of this around?
I think my mum's got some.
I think YouTube needs to find this.
Oh, gosh.
That would be amazing.
That would be embarrassing.
So, what was the idea of Coven, and, you know, how did you, like, you said you'd created it when you were 17. How did it come to be such an awesome book?
Well, no pun intended, I'm sure. It was... See, in my head, when characters have superpowers and what have you, I have to have some sort of justification as to A, why they'd have those powers, and if they're going to put on a spandex costume, why they would do that, you know? It's, in the case of Spider-Man, it's a natural progression, you know. He wants to be a wrestler, so he puts on the costume, and I can go with that, you know. Superman I always squared away, because I always saw it as some sort of heritage costume, like a dress, you know, like a military dress officer, that sort of thing, so I could sort of square that way in my head. And so when I came to the Coven, I couldn't think of any reason why they would be wearing costumes. So I just went for the street clothes approach, which I think worked well for them.
Yeah.
Made them more grounded, more believable, and obviously a lot of people believe in the paranormal, and I thought it was a great way to give people superpowers without having to explain how radioactive ant came and bit them or something like that, you know, because that may have worked in the 60s, but it doesn't necessarily follow in the current day and age, or even back in the 90s. So I just wanted a more credible way for them to you know, come by these powers. And things just percolated in my head. I wanted to do a team, and I needed a character that could find all these different situations and to put them all in, which was Phenomena. because she could sense all those different supernatural happenings and point the team in the right direction. It's really weird talking about it because I haven't talked about the Coven for years. But I had a lot of fun doing that. It was a good times. Black Mass was the first character I created, and he was the seventh son of the seventh son, which made him automatically supernatural. And his older brother was, it was his younger brother, Grimoire, was jealous, but he had a photographic memory and so learnt all these spells and things, which is why he was called Grimoire. He was a walking grimoire. And he was just jealous of his brother, and it sort of paralleled Cain and Abel from the Bible, and that's why I added, there was lots of elements that once you start thinking about something, it sets you off on a chain of events in your head, and you kind of think of other things, and that'd be a good idea. It's the same with Marine Man. I was driving back from Juice's brother's wedding, actually, when all the pieces Marine Man fell into place. My wife had fallen asleep in the car, and I was just driving through the Highlands, and suddenly everything just sort of it was a moment of clarity. It'll happen sometimes. You'll think of stuff as you're going along, and then suddenly it'll all just go, and if I do this, and I do that, and then that'll happen, and then, and it all sort of goes off at tangents. And you just take all the best bits and throw away the rubbish. And that's pretty much how the Coven came together, rather.
Right.
It was just a confluence of events, I guess.
And how many issues ended up actually being released? What's out
there? I don't know. I I can't remember.
Neither can I. I had so many different covers.
It's not so much. Yeah, it's not so much that. It's after things went a little bit cuckoo at the end. Rob licensed the characters out to someone else.
Yes.
I didn't know anything about that, so I don't know how many issues there were. I don't know any of the ins and outs of that. So that would count as part of the run, I would imagine.
No, it doesn't count.
It doesn't? Okay.
I didn't buy them.
Okay.
I only bought your ones.
Oh, that's good to know.
And everyone else here, they're just going, what was Coven?
Coven,
So
Coven was good fun. I mean, if you haven't read it, at least get the first, 6 issues?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think there was at least 6 that you'd done, and there was a prelude or something as well.
Yeah, there was a black and white issue, which was pretty fun, or cool to draw, actually, as I recall. And then there was Volume 2. There was they all had a sort of more revamped look. I think Spellcaster had a baseball hat on. Phantom chopped her hair off.
Yes.
Because this was all before vampires became in vogue, and werewolves and witches and all that. It was in comics, at least. I think Buffy was around at the time, was it? In that sort of era? I'm not sure. I wouldn't. Yeah.
Well, the film would have been around.
But I mean, I created it when I was 17, so
yeah.
It was a long time before that current trend and stuff. But Phantom was a half-blind vampire that was religious and felt dreadful every time she had to kill someone. And then there was Phenomena, who was the sort of girl you'd see on Jerry Springer, but suddenly found she had all these powers and could sense all these, stuff going on and see ghosts and what have you. There was Black Mass, who was just, very strong and naturally resistant to supernatural things. There was Scratch, who was a Catholic priest who was possessed by a demon, which added a lot of conflict. Guys, this is great. I'm going all tingly. Who else was there? There was... one of the bad girls was Pentacle, and she had... ectoplasmic shuriken throwing stars, which she'd throw at people, and if they hit them straight in the middle of their head, it would knock their soul out of their body, knock their astral self out of the body, knocking them out for a number until they could find their way back to their body. I thought that was really cool. And lots of stuff like that. It's a good fun read. I won't tell you too much because otherwise you won't go and read it. But
you got to try and track them down. They're actually not easy to find.
Oh, they're not?
I need to get copies. I don't know what I've got anymore, so I keep trying to find a set, and it's not easy.
Oh yeah, there was Spellcaster as well, and she was a witch, and she had a familiar, which was like a snowy owl, wasn't it? It was like an Arctic owl. And she was called Spellcaster because in my head there were different castes of witches, and she could cast the spells, but she would need another witch to make her stronger. But if things had gone on, it would have panned out that there was a cast of spellbinders, and they work in conjunction with each other to make themselves stronger, and that was the route I was going with her. And her dad was Swan, who was an albino vampire, and he was one of the bad guys, wasn't he?
Yep.
And who else was there? No, I'm sorry. If I'm getting boring, just bring me back on track.
Well, no, I did want to sort of. Obviously, things went a little bit sour at the end of the awesome time. It got a little less awesome. So you moved on. What was the next stage after that? So you'd kind of been out of Marvel and DC, but all of that was still very mainstream. So where did you then take your career?
Well, Awesome kind of dissolved. I'm still working with Rob, I think, after Awesome dissolved, if my memory serves me right. But he was getting work from Marvel. For me, I think I did a couple of Wolverine issues while I was still working with Rob, and then I kind of decided to myself, I can get my own work at Marvel if that's there's no need to go through Rob. So we parted our ways. It was a little bit messy, but like I said, since I've seen him since then, we've been fine. I think there's a great quote from Cocktail, wasn't it? Everything ends badly, otherwise it wouldn't end. I always thought that's something that's always stuck in my head. Tom Cruise movie. But like I say, since I've seen him, since all that happened, we've been fine. And then after, so I did the Wolverine issues, and then I think I got offered the X-Men. I think it was directly after that. Mark Powers. I was on holiday. No, not on holiday. It was New Year, and I was somewhere snowy in the UK with no mobile phone reception, and you had to go to the top of the hill to get any sort of connection. And I got a phone call from Mark. I think it was just prior to New Year's Eve, and he offered me the X-Men. And I said, "Yeah, excellent. I'll take it."
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be the biggest thrill of my life. I was a bit wrong, as it turned out, but I was up for it. I was game to be doing that for a long old while. This is around the time that Grant Morrison was writing the other one with Frank Quitely drawing it, and that's the first time I met Frank and Grant, actually. Really nice guys. Because we all had to go over to New York to have like a summit sort of thing. And just hanging out with him and the two of them, and Joe Casey as well, because I like Joe. I really get on well with Joe. He's actually in a band. I went to a few of his gigs, actually. He's
really?
A good guitarist and everything. Yeah, he's good.
Man of many talents.
Yeah.
Man of action.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And so where was I?
So you got the X book?
Got the X book.
Yep.
I was expecting everything to be great. And it started off well, and I as I understood it in my head, Grant and Frank would be doing the cool book, and me and Joe would be doing like the fun sort of carrying on in the same vein as what had happened before.
Like Claremont-ish?
Yeah, Claremont-ish. Yeah. So that was the impression I was under, and it didn't work out like that. I was happy to start with, and then the storyline was a bit somber and a bit downbeat, a bit too downbeat for my taste. I think Joe, I can't speak for Joe, but I think he felt a bit of pressure being put up against Grant. I don't know for sure, but for one reason or another, I wasn't enjoying myself, and I don't think Joe was either. I think he'd be the first to admit that. And so I'd have a few chats with Richard Starkings, and because he's my go-to guru, really. If I'm at a crossroads, he'll point his Buddha wisdom at me and try and set me on the right track. And he said, if you're not happy, just do something else. And I was getting very unhappy, and I think it's... And I didn't want to be unhappy, because I love comics, and I love drawing comics, and I love creating comics. And I didn't want the magic to fade off, so I figured if I took myself out of the game for a couple of years, or a year, or whatever, then it would rekindle the need and the want to do it. And it kind of worked. I went travelling for a few years, or for a year or so, Went to some wonderful places. I'd recommend it to anybody. And literally after maybe 4 or 5 months of travelling, I wanted to draw comics again.
Yeah.
And I started sketching as I went along to all the different places. And I wasn't even sure whether I'd get work when I came back, or I hadn't had anything set up. I'd stayed in contact with Richard, and I'd stayed in contact with Eddie Berganza at DC.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I came back, I spoke to Eddie, and I ended up doing some stuff for DC, which was my first work for DC, I think.
Yeah.
If memory serves. And I can't remember what it was. It might not have been Supergirl. It might have been something before Supergirl.
Okay, I remember the Supergirl stuff.
Supergirl came about because Jeff wanted me to do that. I've got a long history with Jeff Lowe, but obviously I worked on cable with Jeff. Some of the Heroes Reborn stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff scripted The Coven with me at Awesome.
Yeah.
Off of my plots. And then, obviously, he did a very successful run on Supergirl with Mike Turner, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Who was a good friend of mine as well, Michael Turner. Miss him. Jeff wanted me to do it because he couldn't think of anyone else that could draw in a similar vein to Michael.
Yeah.
And he wanted it kept in that vein so that, the
ball
would
consistency.
the ball would keep rolling. I thought she was painfully thin, but I'd like to have put some more meat on her bones. But at the time, that was selling, so that's kind of what. If you watch over the course of my run, she gradually puts on weight.
Up a little.
Yeah, gradually puts on weight until she's well fed and not in need of a sandwich. Yeah.
Yeah.
So she ended up where I wanted her to be. But obviously, I keep saying obviously, don't I? Jeff left Supergirl to go off and do something else. Joe Kelly came on, and I worked well with Joe Kelly as well. But it wasn't the same without Jeff. It didn't have that same sort of wham pow. I think Joe's a more... at the time, Jeff does the big blockbuster.
Yes.
And I like doing the big blockbuster. Joe's a bit more low-key in some of his stuff, I think. At least the stuff I've read, that may not be the case, I don't know. But from my perception, that was the case. I had fun doing it, but, sometimes you've got to leave the party while it's still raving. And so I did.
I know this is probably jumping forward a little bit, and maybe you can quickly give the link, but Jeff was the one that then drew you back to Marvel for doing Hulk.
Yes.
Was that the first thing that you went back to Marvel with?
Well, what happened with that... How are we doing for time? You're okay. What happened? Okay, ended Supergirl, and then I went on to Titans, wasn't it? It was Titans Special, I think.
Right.
And then I was all poised to go ahead and draw the Titans for the long haul, because I did the first issue and enjoyed doing it, but I started having problems with my shoulder. And I'm not going to go into too many details and what have you, but because we're running out of time and stuff. But it felt like my shoulder was lubricated with broken glass every time I moved it. It really hurt. And so I had to have an operation on it, which didn't go according to plan, and ended up having to have another 2 operations on it to fix the original operation. So that put me out of action for about a year, I think it was, as I recall. And it was during the process of when it was healing that Jeff phoned me up and said, Ed needs some time to catch up on Red Hulk. Will you come and do an arc? And I was very hesitant because, I wasn't sure how my arm was going to cope. I hadn't drawn anything for over a year, and it was only just then getting strong enough to draw on a consistent basis. And I was a little bit gun-shy, I suppose, but Jeff's got a way with words, and that's why he's a writer. And he convinced me to jump on board. One of the things that twigged it, he showed me some pages Art Adams had done, and they were just gorgeous. And I thought, I've got to do it really, haven't I? But I started doing it in the style that everybody was familiar with, the detailed style that I'd become accustomed to. But it was hurting my shoulder. And I had a big chat with Mark Benicia, who was the editor, and Jeff, and they both agreed that if it would help me hit the deadline, I could draw in the way that I was most comfortable, which was the more cartoony.
Yeah.
Now, admittedly, looking back on it, I probably swung too much the other way to a degree. It was way cartoony. It was in line with what Ed was doing.
I was going to say, was there a subliminal thing? Because you said you always sort of meshed it, even if you didn't realise, to what was popular and who had come before. So the Ed stuff would have opened the door to that.
Yeah, unconsciously, I think that's probably what would have had some bearing on it. And so I hit the deadline fine. People seemed to like it. It was quite surprising, actually, because I expected an immediate backlash, but it didn't happen. And so now that gave me the confidence to continue drawing in that style more frequently. I mean, it doesn't suit every project, so I wouldn't do it on every project. I'm currently working on something with Jonathan Ross called The Revenger, and that is a project that it certainly wouldn't work on. You know, it suits Marine Man, and it would suit some DC stuff, I think, and I think it would suit Daredevil. Not Daredevil, Deadpool. Over at Marvel.
Yep.
I think it would suit that. But yeah, it wouldn't work on every project. So I just, you know, at least I've got the flexibility now that I can. If you're one of these artists like Tim Sale who changes his style for every project, you become synonymous with that, and then everybody accepts it. But because I'd been so pigeonholed for so long, you know, I didn't have that flexibility, and now I do, and I quite like the position I'm in.
Yeah.
Currently.
Well, and talking about your flexibility and being able to use that cartoony style, you mentioned Marine Man. So how did it come about that you were actually going to do your own book, a creator-owned book that legitimately, fully was yours and
that
understood?
Was, yeah. Well, it's my dream project was Marine Man, and if I'm going over old ground, then please bear with me. But it was great. I'd finished doing Red Hulk. I'd saved the money that I got from Red Hulk to finance doing Marine Man, because obviously if you're doing, if you're doing a creator-owned project, you have to do it unpaid, really, because you're not working for one of the big companies, you're not getting a page rate. So you have to find a way of financing yourself, and that's how I did it. I spoke to Richard Starkings. I was having a big chat with him at Comicraft over in Santa Monica. And he said, you know, you should do something, because we were talking about Marvel Man, that's right. He had, there's a book about Marvel Man called Kimota, isn't there?
Yep.
I think it's out of print now, I'm not sure. But Richard had a copy on his shelf, and I'd been reading that. And we'd been talking about Marvel Man and the old Mick Anglo stuff, and the more revisionist stuff with Alan Moore. And he said, you should do something that makes you feel the way you used to feel about Marvel Man. And once he said that, it just kept going round and round in my head. And I started thinking back about Marine Man again. And you remember I said when I was travelling, I started drawing after about 4 or 5 months. It was mostly Marine Man that I was drawing while I was travelling, just going through different designs and concepts and just updating everything, because it's a character I kept coming back to. And it obviously, I keep saying obviously, it suited, you know, that style suited Marine Man. So after Richard had said that, I decided to, you know, take the bull by the horns and go down the creator-owned route. Eric Stevenson agreed to publish it, and I wrote it as well. It's my first written published work as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I was expecting a big backlash from that as well, because artists turn writers, and you know the critics all generally sort of, you know. And I was expecting, Churchill thinks he can write, can he? You know, and all those sort of things on all the forums and what have you. And didn't get any of it. People really liked it. And it really surprised me. I wasn't expecting people to take to it as well as they did. And I was very happy about that. And then got the Eisner nomination as well.
Yes.
I had nothing to do with that. That was all down to Eric Stevenson. I think he put that forward.
Sending it in, yeah.
Sending it in, and I was blown away when we got the nomination for that. We didn't win, but it was just a kick in the pants to be nominated.
Exactly.
And I don't regret a single thing about it. You know, it was a lot of hard work, but it was a lot of fun, and just the joy you get going to these sorts of shows and having little kids come up and buy it and saying they've read it with their dad or their mum and stuff. There's just not enough comic books for all ages.
It's true.
And, you know, you look back at the comics you grew up with, or the comics I grew up with, the stuff from John Romita Sr. and Stan Lee and what have you, they're not billed as all ages, but they are all ages comics. Anyone from 6 to 60 can pick one of those up and not be offended by anything in it and have a really good time.
Whereas you actually have to be careful if you're selling comics to kids these days, because it's not quite appropriate for all, and certain parents will freak out. I know this is a problem I have working in a store.
Yeah. And we've got to get kids into comics, otherwise the comic industry is just going to dwindle away and die. Because if we're aiming all the comics at 45-year-olds like myself, or I'm 44, you know, eventually the well is going to dry up.
Yeah.
Or at least change to such a degree that it's not going to be the comic books we remember.
It's true.
Have I got off topic again?
No. I was going to say, I'm going to give you a quick plug, because I think all ages books get a bit of a bad rap. It's become like a bit of a dirty phrase, all ages, and people just assume it's kids' comics. But something like Marine Man, if you haven't read it, is a genuine all ages book, in that kids can read it, but adults can read it. It's just, you know, I think it's written for adults, but there's nothing in there that would be offensive or off-putting to children, so anyone can read it. It's really good. Do you have the trades for sale at your table?
Trades are for sale at the table.
I recommend picking up the trades, because the singles are lovely, but the trade is basically, half of it is the 6-issue mini, and the other half is all this supplementary material. And I think the supplementary material is fascinating, adds loads of value. So I would kind of recommend getting that.
Having said that, there's nothing wrong with grim and gritty comics, you know, and comics did need a kick in the pants in the mid-80s. I just didn't expect it to last for 30 years, you know. It should have lasted for like 5 or 6 years maybe, but not 30.
No, there needs to be that diversity, but it's become a bit homogenised.
Yeah, which is another reason why Image is such a cool company to work for, because there are so many different genres available. You know, there's something for everyone. There are the all-ages books, and there's the more sort of mature readers' side as well. Yeah. Speaking of which, the thing I'm doing with Jonathan is complete reverse turn from Marine Man. It's complete opposite. I said it again. Obviously, I can't talk too much about it. It comes out in January, but it's very violent. There's a fair amount of swearing and sex in it, and more besides. It's pretty loopy. The guy is so imaginative, and he's got so many ideas bubbling around in his head all the time. Initially, we were going to do something else, because the way I hooked up with Jonathan was just after Marine Man. I was out in San Diego. Yeah, that's right. I was in San Diego, and I was selling the trade. And it's the first time I'd ever seen it, because it'd just come out, and Image ordered them to show up at the booth for me. So I'd never seen it until I got to San Diego, and I was blown away by it. It, you know, all printed well. And I had my head down, and I was doing my thing. And it was before I'd gotten into the swing of the show. And I suddenly heard this voice say, "Marine Man, I love Marine Man." And I looked up, and it was Jonathan Ross. And I was like, "It's Jonathan Ross." And I was like, "Hi, Jonathan." And he was really nice, and bought a copy. Wouldn't let me give him one. He just, you know, bought a copy of Marine Man. Had his son with him, and that was the first time I'd met him. And then I was speaking to Eric a little bit later, Eric Stevenson, and he said, "Have you got any interest about working with Jonathan?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, if he wants to. You know, we'll talk about some stuff." And Jonathan was well up for it, and so we talked about doing something, and we were heading down a superhero route. And then he needed a bit more time to spend with Brian on America's Got Powers. So I took a gig at DC that they were offering at the time, Ravagers.
Not to be confused with Revenger.
Not to be confused at all. And I did that for a year. And then everything sort of collided to the point that I ended up doing another project, or finally doing a project with Jonathan. And The Revenger isn't what you're expecting. It's not superheroes. There are some superhero aspects to it. But I really took it on because it's such a challenge. It's all the stuff, and I'm really finding it a challenge as well in a lot of ways. There's lots of real-world locations, which I'm not used to, because anything at Marvel and DC is all imaginary. You know, if it's a city, it's a stylized New York, or it's a stylized this, or it's Metropolis. It's something you can imagine in your head and just draw out. But when you've got real places, you have to make them look like real places.
Yes.
So it's a lot more reference involved. It takes a lot more time. He wanted it in the more detailed style.
You're right.
I haven't done it in the sort of superhero style that you'd find me drawing in at DC or Marvel. It's a different style altogether again.
Right.
It's very detailed. Some of the pages are just ludicrously detailed, but without being so detailed that you can't follow the story or anything. And I was trying to remind myself how I used to draw like that, because I'd forgotten. I'd gotten so into the pattern of drawing in my cartoony style, I was forgetting where all the sometimes I consider unnecessary lines go. You know, and my little.
Where do you add this little flourish? The flair.
The flair, exactly. And so I'm finding it a real challenge. It's like all the things that I wouldn't normally necessarily draw in a comic book, because I'd be working at one of the big two companies, and they shy away from certain aspects. And in an image book, you can do the things that you can't do at other comic book companies. So it's really not anything that you're expecting to see from me. It's probably the best thing Jonathan's written to date as far as comics go, and he's very proud of it, and I think quite rightly so. It's a 4-issue series, and I think if it does well, he's certainly game to do another one. I'd certainly be happy to have another crack at it.
Well, you said that it has been a challenge, and unfortunately our challenge today has been to try and fit your career into an hour, and it's not realistic, because obviously there's a lot to talk about there. I said obviously.
You did?
Hey.
I set a
That's
trend.
the other word of the panel, obviously flair.
Obviously,
That's what we've come
flair.
out
We should
with.
have called that.
That's
what
the name of it in
called,
retrospect.
Obvious flair.
So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you most of all to Ian for all the great work.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone.